Hey guys, it's Patricia from the Bad Chinese Teacher podcast. We are on break this week for the New Year's holidays, but I just wanted to come by, check in, say hi, see how you're doing, and drop this little bonus episode to kind of wrap up 2019, which hopefully has been as kind to you as it has been to me. So hopefully at this point, you guys are relaxing away from school and work, spending time with friends, family, loved ones, and me with this fun little bonus episode. We're going to call this segment Side Tangent, which is just a space to talk about stories that are totally unrelated to the scope of this podcast, which is really about language learning and teaching within the Chinese language classroom and, that nerdy sort of thing. But we are not talking about any of that this week. We are talking about something that happened to me about 6 years ago. That just came to mind recently, and I figure now's as good a time as any to kind of share that with you guys and revel in this little story. So 6 years ago, I was in college. This is my junior year of college, and throughout college, I kept up with writing this blog. This blog no longer exists on the internet. Not because I took it down by my own volition, although that probably would have been a wise and mature choice to make, but really because that blog had a bunch of security issues that kept causing it to get taken down or just disappear from the internet, probably for the better. It's probably a sign from God saying that your college foolishness should not exist on the internet for everyone to see. But in college, I wrote this blog, and the occasion at which I would feel so motivated to write a blog post is just generally whenever anything would pique my interest and or made me really excited or really mad. And so back in 2013, I stumbled upon this video interview with Lin-Manuel Miranda. And if that name sounds familiar to you, it's probably because you know of him from his musical Hamilton. And Hamilton is musical that came out in 2015, kind of changed the landscape of musical theater world probably forever. Kind of changed the conversation on how we view not only history and historical interpretation in the arts, but also race and representation in the musical theater world, which up to that point had largely been, very, very white, very, very privileged and kind of closed off to a certain population of people that, generally speaking, had enough money and influence to, actually afford tickets to Broadway shows. So Hamilton, when it came out in 2015, really changed that conversation, and Lin-Manuel Miranda, as a result, kind of got launched into the public sphere as someone who, he's been doing well, I'd say. But this was 2013, and so this is pre-Hamilton. And in 2013, Lin-Manuel Miranda was not known for Hamilton as much as he was known for his first show, which was called In the Heights, which, to his credit, also won a whole bunch of Tony Awards and did very, very, very well. And back in 2013, that was what I knew Lin-Manuel Miranda most for, because I loved In the Heights. In the Heights is a show that talks about the Latinx community in Washington Heights, an immigrant community, and it kind of focuses on this one guy named Usnavi, who his whole thing is kind of I don't feel at home in New York, and I just want to get back to where my parents came from, because that is home to me, and the show kind of revolves around that concept. It's a real, I'd say, it's a real immigrant story. It's a story about community. It's a story about generational divides, but also generational unity. It's a really special show. And I think when I first heard of it, saw it when I was in college, I loved musical theater since I was a kid. But I had never really seen stories that really spoke to my identity, really something that spoke so deeply to my core as a human being, as much as In the Heights did. And so it's a really special show. And I remember thinking to myself that it was so different because these were stories that were not mainstreamed in a musical theater culture that, again, just was, up to this point seemed just very white and very much not for people like me. And so anyway, 2013, I found this video on YouTube of Lin-Manuel Miranda doing an interview with a media outlet called Thinker. I think you can probably still find this interview clip floating around on the internet. I'll link it to the show notes if I can find it. But in that interview clip, he was talking about what to do with a show like In the Heights that is so focused on a certain ethnic group, so focused on a certain community, and that requires casting people, actors of color, basically, and telling a story through actors in an authentic way, that in which the actor's ethnic identity also, in a sense, plays a part of the story, right? What I'm saying about this is that, like, if you have a story that is talking about the Latinx experience in such an intimate and authentic way as In the Heights did, can you cast white actors to play out the same story? And I don't know if that's a discussion that would nearly be as relevant now, given how much more diverse the musical theater scene has changed to become, which is an amazing thing. But even as recently as 2013, again, like this big question of like, this is a show that only has Latinx characters, or almost only has Latinx characters. We don't have that many Latinx actors in Broadway. So can we cast this show with white people? And I mean, this discussion has been around for forever. I mean, like Miss Saigon, which was a show from the 80s, raised a lot of ire from people even then, because they would cast like white people to play Asian actors and essentially put them in yellowface. And that was just a thing that people would kind of accept, to certain degrees, because you'd be like, well, there are no Asian actors who can play this part, and this is a really great show, and we want to put it on a stage, and so here's what we got to do. This was just kind of accepted. And so the interview was with Lin-Manuel Miranda talking about, in the absence of having a sufficient amount of actors of color to play out this show, is it okay for white actors to fill those roles? And he was talking specifically about In the Heights now being licensed to community theaters and high school theaters. So basically, like, if you have a show on Broadway, it takes a couple of years before you have the rights and the license to be able to put on that show in community theaters and high schools. And so around this time, In the Heights was being licensed out to high school theaters. And that question about like actors of color becomes all the more relevant when you're talking about like high school community theaters. Because, Broadway is Broadway, and you get the best of the best, and you have far more actors of color capable of taking on those parts there. But like, say you're a high school in, I don't know, Branford, Connecticut, where I grew up, where there aren't that many Latinx people to begin with, let alone Latinx high school students who could fill these roles, who are interested in musical theater at their high school, who could conceivably fill those roles. This became a matter of, immediate relevance to me, because in 2013, I was already out of high school at this point, but 2013, my former high school put on In the Heights. I don't remember whether or not there were any Latinx students, actors of color, to fill in the Latinx roles in that show. But I'm pretty sure that like Usnavi was played by a white kid. Nina was played by a white kid. Vanessa was played by a white kid, so on and so forth. And that high school production of In the Heights, was actually the first production of In the Heights I had ever seen. So prior to that point, I was like subsisting my love for the show off of the original Broadway recording. And so I remember seeing this show, seeing it in the context of my high school, which again was very white, and relatively privileged, and seeing the story that I had loved so much because it spoke so much to my ethnic identity as a person of color, as someone who comes from an immigrant family, and being played out by white kids. I was like 20 something at this point, 20 years old. And I was like so overwhelmed by the cognitive dissonance of seeing the story that spoke to every fiber of my being, as someone who, grew up in an immigrant household and struggled so deeply with this question of finding home, which to me, I was like, the white kids that I grew up with have no understanding of that struggle whatsoever. So why in the world do they get to tell this story, right? Do they even understand the depth and the breadth of the story they're talking about as white kids who don't come from, immigrant households, who have never had to struggle as deeply with that question of finding home that I have had to, and the characters in the Heights had to? Why do they get to tell this story? And so I was really conflicted about that as I was watching the show. They did a great job, by the way. It was a really good show. I'm not even gonna lie. Like, I mean, I also graduated from this musical theater program, and I have nothing but good words to say about the quality of that production. And it was very moving to a certain extent to see people who, the kids who were in that show who were seniors at that point were freshmen when I was a senior in high school. So it held a certain degree of specialness to in that respect. But at the same time, from an existential level, I couldn't help but walk away from that show being like feeling very conflicted. And then I found this video interview that Lin-Manuel Miranda did, where he basically just said that he was like, in community theater, in high school theater, anyone of any ethnicity should be able to play any role. And he raised the example of him being in Fiddler on the Roof when he was in high school, and he was like, if not for that high school opportunity, there exists no universe where I would have been able to play a part in Fiddler on the Roof, which true, actually, because I mean, how many roles are there? As a kid who also did high school theater, who had a lead role in a show that was about like 1940s New York, and I played this like taxi driver in an era where like people like me who look like me would have like, I don't know, been interned in like, concentration camps in California. Like, historical accuracy when it comes to the high school stage is something that the high school stage allows opportunities for anyone of any ethnicity to play any part. And that is a great benefit for, kids of color, students of color who in the real Broadway world would have been very, very restricted. And so I agreed with Lin-Manuel Miranda on that front, but I think I was still very bothered by what he was saying, in the sense that like, so you're saying that like the white kids at my high school could tell the story that they have no personal relationship with, and that is okay. I took issue with that, and so like someone who takes issue with anything and has no sense of like, filter or has no sense of social appropriateness, I took to the internet, wrote a like essay about here are the reasons why what Lin-Manuel Miranda was saying is problematic and wrong. Just to get my own thoughts out of the way for that, and just to have an outlet for that. Little did I know that, I don't know, the internet is a big place, but if you're looking for something that talks about yourself, you are bound to find it. So I put up the blog post, go to bed. Morning after, I get a message in my inbox from Lin-Manuel Miranda himself. He had tried to at me on Twitter, could not DM me because I was not following him. This is all verbatim from the email that he sent me. I have the screenshots to prove this. But he sent a message to me via the contact page on my blog, and he basically was like, "Loved your blog post, want to talk about it. Here's my phone number. Call me when you have a chance." I was shook, man. I was so shook. And I mean, like, at this point, okay, I feel like this would probably be a bigger deal nowadays, now that Lin-Manuel Miranda is like actually like a huge public figure. Probably not in any position now to be reaching out to random, angry bloggers on the internet to like say, "Here's my number, call me." Different time and place, but still so shook. So I get this message. I of course go and follow him on Twitter right away, because like, what an embarrassment. Like Lin-Manuel Miranda, king of Twitter, is like, "Hey, tried to DM you, followed you on Twitter, by the way, for all of like 30 seconds, found out you weren't following me, so I couldn't DM you." I'm like, okay, like, this is, no words at this point. So I remember getting this message, getting his phone number. I remember the exact place. I was in New Haven with my mom and my brother at the Educated Burger, which is, I don't even think that's open anymore, but we were getting lunch. I have his phone number. I call him. He's walking his dog. He literally says to me, "I'm walking my dog." The dog that, again, if you follow his Twitter, his dog Toby, walking his dog. And he's like, "Yeah, saw your blog post. Just wanted to talk about it." And we have, I'm sitting like by some random hallway in that restaurant. And we just talk for 30 minutes about what I wrote. and about that interview. And basically, I think at the core of things, all right, this is not so I'm not at the risk of sounding way too self-congratulatory about this. I'm pretty sure that the primary reason why Lin-Manuel Miranda decided to call me was because probably because he didn't want this nobody like slandering him on the internet and accusing him of being like, a colorblind racist. Because I don't remember the exact contents of that blog post, but I don't think I really was too complimentary to him. So to his credit, I mean, like he probably wanted to reach out to clear the air and say that's not actually what I meant. He had mentioned that the Thinker interview was a very trimmed down version of a very, very, very long conversation, and context is everything. But I think we kind of walked away from the conversation being on a mutual level of understanding, if you could really call it that. Because I think at its very core, right? I think thinking about it now, 6 years out, the value of, like having white kids have a hand in experiencing something like In the Heights. I think in this day and age, that is valuable no matter what. I no longer take issue with white kids, in high schools putting on a production of In the Heights. I think the reason why it bothered me so much to begin with was really because, I had a lot of doubt as to whether or not any old musical theater program at a high school was capable of understanding and recognizing the deep profundity of that show. I think, as is the case with a lot of, cultural products that come from, communities of color, when white people come across it, it's the first level of interest is one of intrigue. I think a lot of white communities saw a show like In the Heights as something as being very fresh and cool, and it's hip hop and it's rap and it's different and it's young and whatever. And it's really easy to look at something like that show and see it as somewhat of a novelty. I think, looking at my reaction to seeing, white people put on that show, I think my initial reaction of doubt was really kind of like, y'all are just into this show because you think it's cool, right? It's coming from a very superficial sort of understanding. Y'all don't understand the deeper message behind this. And I don't think it's something you really can understand unless you start actually listening to people of color and talking about their experiences. And I think, I still stand by that. I still think that, like, again, if you're a white community and you're putting on a show like In the Heights, you are obligated to really understand that this is not necessarily your story to tell. And it doesn't mean that you can't tell the story, but if you're going to tell this story, at least, take the time to understand where that story is coming from and realize that you are, just the messengers of that, and your role in that is to open up space for people of that community to tell their stories as well. And so I said this a lot more eloquently in that blog post that no longer is available on the internet for you to read, but that was kind of the crux of things, and I think I still stand by that. But I think that conversation came at a time and a place where I just was at a point in my life where I saw a lot of things that didn't make a lot of sense to me, such as this situation where, like, again, this struck me as being a very personal thing, because it wasn't just some random high school with random white kids putting on this In the Heights production. It was like my high school, and at that point in my life, I had a lot of still was struggling with a lot of hangups about being a person of color in my high school, being Asian at my high school, and realizing that, like, trying to reconcile a lot of my experiences as feeling like I was always very consistently outside of the mainstream, and struggling with a lot of things that a lot of my peers could not relate to, feeling just very, very different, and not finding people who could really empathize with that experience until I went to college. And I don't know, had other Asian friends, and realizing that, like, in the absence of that diversity, you're stuck with kids having experiences where they feel like what they're experiencing is so out of bounds and so abnormal, and feeling very much like a pariah because of that. And so I think the reason why it felt so personal to me was because In the Heights was a cultural artifact, a piece of media, one of the first things that I encountered as a young adult that I could really, that really shook me to my core, because it was one of the first times where someone else had indirectly said to me, I totally understand what you're going through. The most moving part of that show to me, I think someone who struggled in college because of, the lack of context, I don't would say lack of support, but just like feeling like you had to navigate a lot of the college experience on your own, was, Nina's story of going to Stanford and then like realizing that everyone was smarter and richer and more privileged and had so many more tools in their privileged knapsack than you did, and really struggling as a result. So there was that moment. And there was also that's the moment that a lot of people cite as being, relatable. But the song that actually makes me cry every time when I hear it is in the second act of the show. It's a song called Enough, sung by Nina's mother in this show. And basically it's talking about, it's when like, in the show, Nina and her father have like an argument, a fight, and have a real just lack of understanding with each other. And Nina's mother steps in to mediate that. And I don't know, I mean, I can't talk about it here without just getting emotional, but that dynamic was something that, as just felt so relatable and so struck at my heart so much. And when a piece of media like that is so personal to you, you just don't want anyone, anybody to come in and tell that story for you. You know what I mean? And I think at that time when I was in high school, I was just very, very conflicted about knowing that this was a high school that, in my experience, a lot of the times it kind of felt like that, my experiences as a person of color felt a little bit erased. And then all of a sudden they come out with a show that is supposed to tell this story, and yet they're, telling it using, through people who might not have that understanding yet. But okay, let's be fair though. Like in high school, right? I didn't come to that level of understanding until I was an adult. And to put that level of expectation on high school students, on a high school community where all they really want is to just put on a good show, it's a big burden to ask. And so I think the question remains, like if you're, and I think this is a worthwhile question to ask, say a show like Hamilton, right? Undoubtedly will come out for, high school and community theaters to do in the future. Will we be living in a space where people who choose to put on that show, who are in primarily white communities, will they approach this show as something that's being like, this is a cultural landmark at this point, this show, and it's really cool, and so on and so forth, but not be equipped to acknowledge the deeper socio-political ramifications of that show, right? To be able to wrestle with themselves the fact that like this show primarily was so important when it was on Broadway because it was actors of color telling a story about old dead white men. That in itself is so powerful, and you really cannot take that show out of that context without acknowledging that. I think I applied that same logic to In the Heights. And so anyway, I think, that's a conversation that I still have with myself, which for me, again, feels very personal as a person who saw all of this go down, was super involved in musical theater, really, really felt at home in that landscape, even though that landscape when I was growing up was not home to me, I remember, Miss Saigon, if you know of that show, is problematic on many, many levels. But it was one of the only shows that I felt like, even as a kid, I loved that show. Only because it was one of the only shows where I could think to myself, I could imagine a reality where I would become like a Broadway actor, and that would be like the only show I could ever do, right? That's the reason why I liked it so much, was because that was the only show that I knew conceivably in my 11-year-old mind. That I was like, that's the show that that's the only show that would be available to me. And that's kind of like messed up if you think about that, to have an 11-year-old kid already know at that age that like, you could love musical theater as much as you do, but there are many, many things that will always be be off limits to you, so you take what you can get. And so I think that's something that's worth thinking about and continuing the discussion on. But anyway, back to Lin-Manuel Miranda and this incredible phone call. I remember, it was a 30-minute phone call, and we talked about a lot. He talked about Hamilton in that phone call, and at that point it was still known as the Hamilton mixtape. And I remember him. I can't even imagine how frustrated he must have been running into a person like me who like waxes poetic and rambles on about like how colorblind casting, and he's working on this show that literally takes that entire concept, turns it on its head. Man, like I'm eating my words. We talked about that. We talked about, at that time, the other show besides In the Heights that really kind of affected me at that time was also Next to Normal, which was affecting to me on a different level, on a mental health sort of level. And I remember mentioning to him that it would be so awesome to see a production of Next to Normal with an Asian American cast, because mental health issues are something that is kind of taboo to talk about. And that 6 years ago it was taboo to talk about at that time, regardless of the community you were in. But it's particularly taboo in Asian American communities. And to have that very same story, like I was thinking in my mind at that point, like how cool would it be? How amazing would it be to have a production of Next to Normal? You don't need to change anything about the characters or even their names or their stories, but just have Asian faces telling that story. How profound would that be? I remember mentioning that to him. Not saying that conversation was a result of it. This was a result of that conversation, but a couple years later, East West Players in California did have a production of Next to Normal with an all Asian American cast, which I didn't see because I don't live out that far. But the fact that exists to begin with, I mean, shows how far we've come in the conversation about race and the theater world. But I remember mentioning that to him. But the one thing I'll remember the most is, despite the fact that the only pieces of writing that he had ever seen from me were basically, roast pieces, questioning his character as a woke person, he had said to me, "You are a writer." And I think people say that to you, like people who see your work and are validating you and affirming your existence and affirming your skill and ability. It's one thing. Man, I mean, when Lin-Manuel Miranda calls you up and says, "You are a writer and you should continue doing that," I'm just like, I mean, I'm not at that point in my life. I was still pretty intentional about, going into journalism and making writing a full-time career for myself. But, and at that point I was like just starting to look for jobs and really starting to become worrisome about my future as a writer. But, and now that has changed a little bit. I don't think that I know I still write, but it's not my career. But that doesn't detract from the weight of those words. To have someone who you look up to a lot, who is honest to God, probably one of the most brilliant writers of our time, to have someone like that say that to you, I mean, that's something that I will always carry with me, and so, and all that is to say, you don't have to be Lin-Manuel Miranda for your words to have an impact on someone, but that validation is so important because, you put stuff out there, you don't know whether or not it's good, and to have someone to affirm that for you is the most powerful thing. So, this is just, I don't know, just a a fun story to look back upon, and to know that someone at some point in my life spoke into me at a time where they honestly really didn't have to. Again, I think I'll always preface this story with the fact that I don't think Lin-Manuel Miranda called me to compliment me on how good a job I was doing with my life, or because he was I think he called me just because he was this massive misinterpretation of my ideas cannot be. I cannot allow this to propagate itself any further. I cannot allow this person to continue slandering me on the internet, which again, understandable, but I think I will always remember that conversation. So. Yeah. Anyway, figured I'd leave that story with you as you continue your restful time at home, hopefully, or amongst loved ones. Say something that encourages someone today. You'll never know how far it'll take you. I don't think that, again, for Lin-Manuel Miranda at that juncture in his life to just call up this rando on the internet to talk to her, that is just something that I always remember and something that will always strike me as being incredible. So no matter your station in life, though, no matter whether or not you are, just some random person like me, some regular dude, or you're someone who, I don't know, is a MacArthur Genius Grant winner and, one of the greatest cultural icons of our time, what you say matters and how you encourage people matters. And so, just leaving you on that note. So anyway, we'll be back next week with a real episode, continuation off of the super nerdy TPRS episode talking about how to teach Chinese in an effective way. Next week, that episode is, I think, a little bit more relevant to those of you who are not coming at it from a teacher's perspective. If you are, particularly if you're a heritage speaker of Chinese, I want you to listen to that one because I think it speaks into a lot of my own experiences as a heritage speaker, and hopefully it'll come across as being useful and thought-provoking to you as well. So if you have not followed this podcast social media handles, go ahead and do that. We are at Bad Chinese Teacher on Instagram, at Bad Chinese Teacher Pod on Twitter, and on Facebook, just search us up, Bad Chinese Teacher Podcast. If you are not subscribed on your favorite podcasting platforms, whether that be Apple Podcast or Spotify or Stitcher or SoundCloud, I'm working on getting everything on SoundCloud as well. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button so that you can be notified when these new episodes drop, which is every Monday. So if you find me interesting, you can follow me on social media. I am at Patricia Liu on Instagram, at Patricia SQ Liu on Twitter. And you can follow my latest writing on my blog, which is blog.patricialiu.net. So that leaves us with that for this week, this short little bonus episode. We'll be back next week with our usual regularly scheduled programming. But until then, I will see you next week. Bye-bye.